Everyone here on this Lord's Day. I pray that you would have a deep and intimate time of worship with our Lord, to be encouraged by His Word and by His Spirit. And in that light, if I could kindly ask everyone to please stand, please rise for the reading of God's Word. We're continuing along in our series in the book of Philippians, our series entitled Heavenly Joy. And so our passage this morning comes to us continuing along in the first chapter, verses 18 to 26. So please give your undivided attention to the reading of His holy Word. May His Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, speak and bless you here through His reading. Philippians 1, 18 to 26. What then, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. This is the reading of the word. Please be seated. So we're continuing along in our series in the book of Philippians, our series entitled Heavenly Joy. A joy that I pray that all of us would understand and be able to apply to the various relationships and everyday aspects of our lives. And as we saw last week, we looked particularly on verse 18, and we saw that the Apostle Paul is joyful. He rejoices because of the gospel being preached, whether in pretense or in truth, to the people in Philippi. And he rejoices in that. He was thankful for that. He was happy about that. Whether in pretense or truth, the gospel was being preached. We see this in verse 18. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. And as we transition to our passage here this morning, he continues along with this idea of joy, but there's sort of a shift in the Apostle Paul's thinking because he moves from present joy, from the gospel being preached, to future joy of what he will face in the future. Does that make sense? He's moving from present joy to future joy. There's a shift in the passage from 18b to 26. Look at verse 18 again towards the end. He says, and in that I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. So he's thinking, this is what I'm happy about now. This is what I'll be happy about as I look into the future. And it's highlighted also in this passage where you can't necessarily see this in the English, but all the verbs in verses 18 to 26, all the verbs with the exception of one, are all in the future tense. So that tells us Paul is changing. He's sort of shifting his heart and his thinking from present joy to future joy, from things that he's happy about now to things that he is facing in the future and will rejoice in the future. Because if you think about it, Apostle Paul, he's chained to a Roman guard all day. He's in Roman imprisonment. Think about it for a second. Try to put your person into his place, and you'll realize that here you have the greatest missionary, the greatest preacher. He's the greatest church planter, and he's now a prisoner chained to a Roman guard day in and day out, and he's facing a literal situation of life and death and execution. He doesn't know what's going to happen. The greatest, perhaps, church planter that ever lived. And he's facing a life and death situation. But the funny thing is when you look at Paul in this situation, as he looks at literally, will I die, will I live? He's calm, he's composed, and he's joyful. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that miraculous? Isn't that actually a little bit weird perhaps? How can he face life and death, but face these sort of situations with such calm and joy? He says, as I look about whether I live or die, I will rejoice. No, that's weird if you think about it from the worldly perspective, but what's his trick? How is he able to do this? How can he face the possibility of life and death, be joyful that he has triumphed and been victorious even in his heart because he will rejoice? What's his trick? How can he do this? And the challenge is here today, how can you do this? Can you say that for yourselves, whether you think about good or bad, your future? Can you say, I will rejoice no matter what happens in your life? Are you able to do that? Do you have that sort of heart, that sort of robust understanding of the grace of Jesus? Do you have that quote-unquote trick of the Apostle Paul? Because if we're honest with ourselves here, we face a lot of decisions in life. You don't know what's going to happen to your job. You don't know what's going to happen to your marriages or your children. You don't know what's going to happen to your personal life goals, your financial situation. You don't know what's going to happen in terms of all your character and the prestige and power that your heart desires. You don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. And these questions, these decisions, whether good or bad, are not to downplay your suffering, but at least we could say it's far less perhaps than what the Apostle Paul is facing, isn't it? That he's facing life and death, and yet he's facing this with joy and calm and composure. We face decisions of good and bad, but oftentimes we're anxious, we're angry, we don't know how to face these things, we're frustrated, we don't know how to be calm and cool and composed. And so the Apostle Paul, he not only teaches, but he lives this sort of composure out, and he says, this is what I want you to learn. This is how you're going to be able to do this. And for him, the passage gives us the answer. And it's a biblical truth that redefines your entire life. That's how you're able to do it. It's a biblical truth, an all-encompassing motivation and goal. It is a reality that will saturate everything about you. And if you grab it, if you understand this, if you redefine your life in the way that the Apostle Paul does, you can face adversity, uncertainty, life or death, but be cool, calm, composed. And you too, like the Apostle Paul, can say, because of Jesus, I will rejoice. And that truth, that reality is given to us. The punchline is this in verse 21. That's the key to living like this, and the Apostle Paul calls it a life with Christ. You want to be composed, you want to be sort of cool and rejoice no matter what life throws at you. The challenge, the call here is to grapple and to wrestle and to define your life according to verse 21. For to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. If you understand this, if you can apply it, if you could flesh it out in your life and in your heart, you can face up and downs in your life, you can face life and death, and you literally and genuinely can say, I will rejoice. I'll be calm, I'll be joyful, and I'll be composed. And this truth, this identity, is what calibrated the Apostle Paul's heart and his life, and it can calibrate and saturate your life too, so that you can resonate with what the Apostle Paul says. So this morning, as we consider this truth, this great truth in verse 21, I want to consider this sort of approach to life and to work this out. And so there's two simple points. One, we're going to flesh out verse 21. What is this life with Christ? What is Paul saying when he says to live is Christ, but to die is gain? Secondly, I want to sort of flesh this out and saying, if you grapple and if you grasp, if you truly believe verse 21, these are some of the things that will flow out of your lives. In other words, if you understand your identity and your life is redefined in Jesus, then there are two characteristics that Paul gives that'll say, this is how you know you really have found and redefined your life in Jesus. So those are the two things we'll consider. What is this life in Christ, and how does this work out in joy? That's where we're headed. So point number one, we'll spend maybe about 60% of the time here. Point one, life with Christ. Now in verse 20 again, Paul says, he really desires Christ to be honored in his life, whether in life or death. And so if you think about this, how is he able to do this? How can he say, whether in life and death, in my body, I want to magnify and honor Jesus? And the Apostle Paul shows us how he does this. I told you this already. He shows us how he does this. He opens his heart up, and he says, this is the truth that freed him to approach life in this way in verse 21. He lets us on in his thinking. He lets us know his difficulty and sort of like opening up his diary and saying, I'm sort of going through this discussion within myself, a struggle. Should I choose to live? Should I choose to die? I don't know which one I'll choose. It's difficult, but in verses 21 to 26, he lets us in on this reality, and it begins in verse 21 again, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And he shows us his truth. And he says, this is my life. He says, this is what I live for. This is the most important thing to me. My joy and confidence are tied down, not to the circumstances in this life, but they're tied down to this one truth of his life. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. And Paul here literally is contrasting living and dying. He's literally saying, which one I will choose, I don't know, because it's a hard decision in verse 22. And the reason it's hard is because of this. When Paul says, should I live or should I die in 21, he's saying it's not a choice about bad life and good life. He's saying the reason it's hard is because it's a choice between what is good and what is better. Do you see that? See, we think death and life, oh, one's certainly bad, one's certainly better. No, death is bad, to live is better. But Paul is saying, no, it's a hard choice because it's not bad and good. It's what's good and what's also better. That's what Paul is trying to say. He's contemplating ultimate life here. That's understandable because he's in prison. In these decisions, it wasn't an easy one because it's a choice. This is good, but this is even better. Which one shall I choose? Well, how do I know that's what he's going through? Well, verses 24, 25. If I live, it is for your joy and faith, is what Paul says. But if I leave, in verse 23, it is far better to be with Christ. Far better literally means much rather better. Literally, he's saying far better is by far the best. Paul is saying this is an emphatic superlative. He's saying it's good for me to stay for your joy and for your faith, but if I die, I get to be and gain with Christ in the fullest expression of his glory. That, in an emphatic superlative, is far better. By far the best is what the Apostle Paul says. That's his strong desire. You could even say, based on that word, it's an over-desire. His personal preference is to be with Christ, and that is why to die in this earthly clinical sense would be far better for Paul. You see, friends, let me explore this a little bit. When we think about life and death, we don't think it's the decision between good and better, do we? We don't say to live is good, but to die is even better. We don't really say that. I mean, if you do, I admire you, but I think most of us probably don't. I struggle with that. I don't necessarily feel like that. And some of us think that it's better to live because you don't know what's going to happen after you die. Even if you're a Christian, you're wondering, what's going to happen? I didn't live a good life here. Maybe I'm saved, but I fear the judgment of Christ. I fear the judgment of God. Or if you're not a believer here today, you're thinking, I don't know what's going to happen in life. I don't know what happens after I pass away from this life in the world. And so you're fearful, and you're saying, certainly because I don't know what's happening after I die, it's far better just to live here. Let me just live it up in the now, to live in the desires of the flesh, to live in the passions of the now. You think like this because you don't know what's going to happen in the afterlife. You don't really know. And as Shakespeare said in Hamlet, he says, our consciences makes cowards of us all. We know that we didn't do well, and that makes us fearful of the future. So let's just live it up now when we can. This is the good life. And others of you sort of resonate with this, and you're saying, yeah, certainly this is the better life now, because look at all that I've achieved. Look at all the money that I've gained. Look at all the prestige and power. This world here, we need to live it up. It's the best that we could ever have. It's nothing better than this world can offer that the world after can offer. This is it. This is the best that we could have. Look at all that I've gained. And that's how you feel. So you're thinking, better to live now, not good to die, because this is the best life that we have now. But I want to say, that's not what the Apostle Paul is saying. Let me try to flesh this out. Sort of a silly illustration. Imagine that you're craving for this hamburger, and you're thinking, I want a juicy hamburger with no lettuce, tomato, raw onions. I want the best hamburger that's out there. Big Mac, McDonald's, In-N-Out, whatever it may be for you. The best hamburger that I want. But, your family, your friends, whoever you're with, let's go to an Italian restaurant. So you go there at an Italian restaurant, you're eating this food, and you're taking it in. And actually, this food is pretty good, but it doesn't satisfy my craving for a hamburger. This Italian food it satiates my hunger, but it doesn't satisfy the desire for a burger, something more. It's not fully satisfying. It satiates, but doesn't fully satisfy. And the reason I say this is because this world here, as good as it is, for your life, no matter how good this world is essentially in your Christian life that Italian restaurant. It can satisfy, it's good, but it'll never fully satiate, never fully gratify, never fully fulfill the desires of your soul. Because as C.S. Lewis says, if I find within myself a longing that this world cannot meet, then it probably means I was made for another world. So if you're thinking, that world after this earthly life is not good, let's live it up now, everything in this world is essentially a pasta that can satisfy, but it'll never satisfy you like the burger that you're seeking after. The things of this world cannot give you what Jesus Christ in his union with you can satisfy you with. And so that's what the Apostle Paul is fleshing out. He learned the trick to that. He understand and experience the reality of that. But still yet, some of you, maybe a few of you, struggle in this world and saying, this life here is really bad. There's death everywhere. There's injustice everywhere. I'm in a lot of debt. I feel depressed. And you're thinking, it's better to go on and pass away from this world because this life here is weak, it's horrible. So let me pass away so I could get to the good life after. I don't care, I don't know what's going to happen. It's definitely better when this world has to offer to me today. Now, I read an article the other day about a University of Pennsylvania student who was depressed, clinically depressed. And, he was struggling with depression, and he attempted suicide by jumping off the bridge somewhere near campus, I believe. And so luckily, the people were able to talk him off the bridge. Now, it's interesting because you get to see this person, this student's perspective on life, someone who's deeply depressed. And as he stands on the bridge, they asked him, what did you see when you looked down into the water? And he says, as I looked down into the river, in the waves and the water, all I saw was an ocean of peace. I saw a relief from the pain and the tragedies of this world. I saw an escape route because this world is so difficult. And I want to pass away from this bad, horrible life in this world so I could go to something better just as a release from all the difficulty. See, all these different worldviews, all these different approaches to life, whether you resonate with this, are not what the Apostle Paul is saying. Do you know why, people, we struggle like this? Do you know why we say, this world is really good, so let's just live it up? Or we say, this world is so bad, so let's just get away with this life and go to the afterlife? Do you know why you think like this? People who think like this, you and me, the reason we feel like this is because ultimately we understand our life as determined by the circumstances around us. Isn't that the case? If life is good, we have a lot of money, a lot of career, a lot of success in life, family's doing well, this life is really good. I don't want to live in the life after. But if life is actually bad, there's marital difficulty, there's difficulty with job, there's financial debt, if the circumstances of your life are bad, this life is horrible, let's wait till the life after. If you fluctuate like this, then it's saying you're living your life as tethered and tied down to the circumstances of your life. But the Apostle Paul is different. The Apostle Paul says it's not about good or bad. It's not about bad or good. He's saying this decision in verse 21 is a decision between good and better. Do you know why? Because for Paul, his life was not bound up in the circumstances of his life. His life was bound up in the Lord of his circumstances, Jesus Christ. For to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. He's facing life and death. There's no worse circumstance or predicament that you could find yourself. Tied to a Roman guard, you're thinking whether I live or die, but he says, my life is not defined or determined by the circumstances I find myself in, by the Lord of circumstances who determines and defines my life. That's why he's able to face this prospect of uncertainty and say, I will rejoice, verse 18b. And that's what he says. And his decision here is between good and better. Over and over again, I want us to get that across in our thoughts, in our thinking. It's good and better. I heard a story of a church somewhere, I think in Texas, where there was a woman who was a terminally ill cancer patient, and she grappled and understood the truth of this passage and says, this world is good, but to be with Christ is far better. She resonated with this, a terminally ill cancer patient, and she grappled with it. She understood it. She resonated with this. The life that defines me is not the circumstances I find myself in, but by the Lord of my circumstances, Jesus Christ, who defines my life. That's why she was able to face the hardship of cancer with joy. And as she was sharing this, as the story goes, in the hospital, in that room, her daughter walks in. I think about 4 or 5 years old. And she says, Mom, I need my shoes tied. And she said, I know it's far better to be with Christ, but my daughter still needs me to tie her shoes. And that's what the Apostle Paul is saying. It's good and better. And he's saying, for you Philippians, your church, it's better for you if I stay so I can minister to you, but in my heart, I have an over-desire to be with Jesus. I want to be with Christ because it is far better, but I look at the church, and there are a lot of shoes that still need to be tied. So it is better for you if I stay. And do you know why he's able to do this? That's Paul's heart. He says, I want to be with Jesus, but for you, your shoes need to be tied. And this is what the Apostle Paul is saying, that his life is determined by Jesus. So whether he turns to life, he turns to Christ. Whether he turns to death, he turns to Jesus. And that's why, as J.I. Packer said, and I think in Knowing God, he says, whenever you turn your life to Christ, you will always get more and not less. You will always get more and not less. You may have to define that from a kingdom perspective, but every time you turn your life to Jesus, you always get more and not less. It is better for me to live as Christ turn to life, you have Jesus. But to die is gain. You turn to death, you get Jesus. It's not about circumstances, it's about the Lord of your circumstances. As I pray that we'll grapple with this, we'll understand this, that this truth will resonate in your heart, that the foundation, identity of your life is not about what you achieve or accomplish or what you have done in this world, but it's about what Jesus has done for you, that he has died for you and has gave his Spirit to you, so that for you, you could resonate with the Apostle Paul in your heart, in your life. For to me, to live is Christ, but to die is to gain more of Christ. And I pray that's what will characterize us. Secondly, if you grapple with this, if you get it, the Apostle Paul says, this is how you ought to live your life. It's sort of like a two-way street. If you get this, then you'll live like this. It's sort of an indication. You could sort of look around at people, not judgmentally, but saying, if somebody really grapples verse 21, if somebody really gets it, there are two ways that it will naturally flow out of people's lives. This is how it shows itself. One, in verse 19, you will rejoice for salvation. And then verse 20, you will rejoice in magnification. And I'll explain that when I get there. So how do you know someone really resonates and gets verse 21? Two things. They will rejoice in salvation. They will also rejoice in magnification. Now that's what Paul says. Again, verse 18. I will rejoice. How? Verse 19, salvation. Verse 20, magnification. The word there in verse 20 is actually honor, but I like the word magnification. So let's look at this briefly. Verse 19, he says, for I know this will turn out for my deliverance. That word deliverance there is the word for salvation. Now, every other time in the New Testament, that word deliverance, I think it's translated as salvation. And Paul usually is talking about here a deliverance from the wrath and the penalty of God's judgment. Christ has saved you from that. So he says, I will rejoice because I know that this will turn out for my salvation, for my deliverance. Now, some people here, or commentators, will say, this deliverance is talking about just being freed from prison. Others say, no, this is talking about being delivered from sin and condemnation of God. And then you have people like Sinclair Ferguson, who says, well, it's probably both. He's probably saying, I'll be delivered from prison, but also be delivered from salvation from sin. But I personally think that it might be both. But even if it is, the thrust of the Apostle Paul's heart is that he has what they call an eternal perspective. You know, he's thinking, I will rejoice because I know that my present suffering will turn out for my salvation. I'll be vindicated. I'll be showed to be faithful. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying. It moves him in this way. He's saying this moment of suffering in prison, well, it's just a moment. And it'll lead me to deliverance. He says, with the prayer of the Philippians and the Spirit of Christ, I will be able to see the glory in the midst of difficulty. I will be able to see that in the midst of suffering, a reason to rejoice. And he says the reason he's able to do this is because I live for Christ. Does that sort of make sense? See, what colors the Apostle Paul's interpretation, his understanding of the world and life, is that his life with Christ is what colors everything, not his circumstances. And he's saying that as he thinks about his life in Jesus, I will rejoice in salvation, I will rejoice in deliverance, because even in my momentary suffering, this is turning out for the greater good of what God has planned for me. That is the Apostle Paul's purpose. That is reason, his motivation. See, deliverance here is a good word that's translated. It's a good word choice, because it tells us, and it captures the sense that, well, you'll be delivered out of your suffering. That your suffering is just a momentary moment, that is temporary. That your suffering in sin, in other words, you'll get out, you'll be delivered. Your present circumstances is used to hone and to change and to glorify Christ in your life. It's a momentary suffering. That's why the word deliverance is good. Suffering in sin is a temporary reality. And for those of us who define our lives as to be with Christ, that gives us a perspective to say, even in the middle of this suffering, I know I can rejoice because this suffering will turn out for my deliverance. I'll be delivered. It's temporary. God has a purpose and plan. See, the Apostle Paul, the reason he's able to do this is because his life, again, was not tied to his circumstances, but tied to Jesus. That Christ saved him from the penalty of sin. That Christ saved him from the power of sin. That Christ will save him from the presence of sin. And he understands this, and that's why he says, no matter what life throws at me, whether good or bad, I know that it is all in the plan of God and it will turn out for my deliverance. So somebody who gets verse 21, they will be able to rejoice even in the middle of their circumstances that are tough, even in the middle of suffering. So the greatest way that you could figure out, does somebody really get verse 21? When the rubber hits the road and life takes a turn for the worse, how do they respond? And let me say something here. That this sort of application in verse 19 is not an easy application. It's not to say, okay, now that I know this, tomorrow when I suffer, I'm going to be able to apply it real easily. This is, in some sense, advanced Christianity, because this is something, to rejoice in suffering is something that takes maturity. It needs to be developed. So it's not something that's simple and easy, can be easily applied. It takes time. It takes work. It takes immaturity. But the Apostle Paul is saying, I can do this, and so can you, if you grapple, if you resonate and grasp the truth of verse 21. See, in other words, as we move to the last point, when tragedy and suffering hits your life, it'll destroy your life if your life is defined by circumstances. If your life is defined by your job and you lose it, you will think that tragedy hit my life and life is destroyed. But tragedy will hit your life, it'll shake your life, but not destroy it, if your life is defined and determined by Jesus Christ. Do you see the difference? If tragedy hits your life, it'll destroy it if your life is defined by your circumstances. But tragedy will shake your life, but won't destroy it if your life is determined and grounded in Jesus. And that's what the Apostle Paul shows. And he says, pray for me, and the Spirit of Christ will dwell within me, so that I may live this out in my life. And last but not least, how do you know someone got verse 21? Well, they'll rejoice in their suffering. They'll rejoice. They rejoice for the fact that they'll be delivered in salvation. But secondly, Paul says this, a person who says to themselves, to live as Christ, will not only rejoice in deliverance, but also rejoice in magnification. Not just salvation, but magnification. And I get that from verse 20. It says, I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my life, whether by life or death. So he says, I will not be ashamed. And he says, Christ will be honored in my body, whether life or death. How do you know that someone actually understands and defines their life by Christ and not circumstances? Well, they rejoice in salvation, but they also rejoice in magnification. Magnification of Christ, whether by life or by death. That's what he says. See, Paul here, look at his life. And he says, whether I die or live, I rejoice, because if I live or I die, I will honor Jesus. Remember, that's what he says. If I stay, it is for your glory in Jesus. If I die, I get to gain Jesus. Whether in life or death, whether Caesar vindicates me or Caesar condemns me, I know that Christ will be honored, and that's why I won't be ashamed. See, honor again means magnify, to enlarge. Paul is saying a person who gets 21 will be like a magnifying glass. You'll bring clarity to the grace and the love of Jesus, whether in your life or death, in your body. That's the big difference here. Because for Paul, he says he will bring clarity to Jesus, the surpassing worth of Christ, by remaining faithful to the gospel and faithful to God's calling as an apostle. He'll show to Caesar and to Rome that the goal of his life, the motivation of his life, is to honor, to magnify Jesus. That is an indication that he got verse 21. His motivation, sense of purpose in everything that he does. His identity and definition of life was not tied to his achievements and circumstances. It was tied not to the circumstances of Rome, but to the circumstances in the person of Jesus Christ. When he says, I will not be ashamed, he's not thinking about people around him. He will be ashamed by the Roman guards. He will be ashamed by the people around him because he will suffer for the gospel. But he's not ashamed because he will be faithful, and it's the approval and purpose of God that will resonate and be the foundation of his life. See, Paul had so much to boast in, didn't he? That he was an educated Jewish man under the tutelage of Gamaliel, a very famous teacher. He knew the law of God. Even in later Philippians 3, he says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I had the best family lineage, the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Roman citizen, so he exercised that right and says, bring my case up to Caesar himself, sort of elevated it to the Supreme Court. He was a man who was accomplished. Also, from the Christian perspective, he was the world's greatest evangelist. He was the world's greatest church planter. No one, of all those resumes out there here today, all those resumes, all impressive, no one can write on the resumes, I wrote 13 letters of the New Testament. No one could ever say that. Paul could write that on his resume, but even then he says, I have a lot to brag about, but my confidence, the reason that I could really not be ashamed is not because I accomplished a lot in this world. It's because of the calling and the approval of God and my faithfulness to the gospel. Because everything else that he accomplished, although good, were still tethered to the things of this world. Do you see that? That's why his approval, his understanding of life, his being not ashamed was tethered to the approval of God that he'd be faithful, not to the approval of people. And for Paul, the reason he would not be ashamed would come from the purpose of God as an apostle, to be faithful to the gospel and what that means for him. So whether Caesar let him live or die, Paul would magnify Christ in his life. And that means for you, there's a lot of application that could be fleshed out. That means for you, what are you ashamed of? What drives you? That means for you, is it the sense that you care more about being ashamed in front of people because of what you accomplished or what you didn't accomplish? Or are you really just being faithful to the gospel, even at the sake of money and prestige and power, even for the sake of comfort? Is that what drives you? I pray that it would. I pray that would be true for me too and for everyone here. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying. Perhaps the scholar Ellicott said it the best. He says, according to this passage, my body will be the theater in which Christ's glory will be magnified. My body will be the theater in which Christ's glory will be magnified. What sort of magnifying glass are you here today? Do you magnify the importance of your relationship or your marital status, as Elder Daniel has said? Does your life magnify the importance that you want to be powerful and prestigious? Does your life magnify the reality that money means a lot to you? Does your life magnify the fact that you really want to be successful and earn a lot of degrees and that your identity is grounded in the number of acronyms following your name on the business card? What is your life magnified? Because for Paul, he got verse 21 and he says, because I do, my life is defined not by circumstances but by Jesus, and because of this, my life, my body will be a theater to magnify the glory of Christ. And so I pray for everyone as we come to a close. I pray that all of us will be magnifying glasses for Jesus. I pray, as Ellicott said, that we would be bodies that in our death and resurrection with Christ, we would magnify the glory, love, truth, and grace of Jesus. That together we're all little theaters that come together in one grand theater in the church, that in this church, that we would magnify the glory of Christ, just as like 1 Peter, I think it says, that angels see this glory and they long to look in the church because in the church they behold the wisdom of God. That's what I pray that our church would be like. Our vision here, which we'll explicate and I'll explain, is really about ultimately creating worshipers. We want to cultivate worshipers to give God all the glory. That's what we're about here. Whether outreach or service or inreach, all that's to cultivate worshipers. And that's what I pray, that when we worship, we will be this theater. And I pray that in your daily lives, you would resonate with verse 21. Think about it. Challenge yourselves. Because I pray that as we sing this song, as sometimes in this church, that we could sing with our hearts, that we would say, on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All of the ground is sinking sand. And I pray that that would be us. Please pray with me at this time. Father, I thank you, Lord, that you show us in the life of the Apostle Paul that he is not our ultimate goal, but he is an evidence or example of Jesus Christ in him. So I pray for each and every one of us that we would be able to work out our salvation to such a degree that we would consider in our heart of hearts to live is Christ and to die is to gain. And our lives will be determined and defined and grounded and saturated with the reality that Jesus died for us, and that is where we get our ultimate source of satisfaction and joy and reassurance and security. And that will flesh itself out, that we may rejoice in the salvation and deliverance, even in the middle of suffering, that we may rejoice by magnifying Christ in our bodies, whether in life or death. So, Lord, make this a reality. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus Christ. Amen.